Why, hello there.
Hello there.
General Kenobi. Of course, Sony have released the A1 Mark II, and if you've been living under a rock, you've probably already seen a number of videos on it. The A1 Mark II, of course, doesn't really deviate from its predecessor, and let's talk a little bit about the specifications. The camera is, of course, a 50 megapixel full frame sensor. It's got the ability to shoot 30 frames a second of raw photo, as well as the 8K 30p and the 4K 120, as well as the HD 240p in video, which is some nice specs there, but it's not too different from what you got out of the original A1. Now, you got built-in wireless, great connectivity. This camera is really built to be a workhorse, but that being said, there are some key differences, and perhaps one of my favourite is A9 Mark III body to it, and I got to say it's one of the most comfortable camera bodies Sony have pretty much ever produced. As you know, their cameras are great, they just don't particularly always feel fantastic. The main benefit of this is that you've actually got the ability to do pre-shooting. This is in a lot of other cameras at the moment, and it actually gives you up to a second of photos before you press the trigger. Of course, it does come with the A7R5 screen, which we'll go into once we have a look over the actual body itself, which is a nice added extra. It's the only issue that I've had with my A1 in particular is the fact I can't swivel around the screen and look at this beautiful, beautiful face. The A1, as you can see, also has a lot of the touch interface upgrades from the other models in the Sony lineup at the moment, making it easier to navigate, but also adding some of their functionality like the auto reframing and that kind of stuff. So the LCD screen resolution is a lot better, with 2.095K dots on the new one and then 1.440K dots on the old one. Why don't they just say 1.0, whatever? And then, of course, you've got a faster Ethernet port on here. It actually does 2,500 megabytes per second rather than the 1,000 on the previous one. And then you've got the focus bracketing on this one, which will be interesting to actually test out. That's mainly used for macro and then some like landscapes to build out an overall high resolution image. So it'll be interesting to test that out whilst we've got the ability to. You've actually got a better image stabilization unit inside of here with 8.5 stops inside of the camera rather than the A1 at 5.5 stops, which is a significant upgrade overall when it comes to the image stabilization. Of course, the other thing that you've got here and what most people will be really looking at is the real-time recognition autofocus, which has come from all of the other units. So we're going to go out now and actually do some shooting, test it out in a bunch of different situations. The autofocus, the image tests, all of that will come in the field, and I hope you're going to enjoy what I'm going to be shooting this with. I am very super excited. So in the attempt to shoot as much as possible with this camera, I managed to bump into a model that I know in the street, and thank you a lot for today, as it helped me just kind of fill out kind of what I can test out with this camera. We did a little bit of an autofocus test as well as a stabilization test. This camera has a remarkable stabilization, 8.5 stops of image stabilization internal. Now, just turning on the Ninja phone to record the internal settings to talk a little bit more about them. Of course, when it comes to Sony, you've got quite a lot there, and with these new settings in particular, I'm just going to go over a few bits and pieces. Of course, when it comes to just going into the menu, of course, going into video, go up to image stabilization, you can go to standard and you can go dynamic active, which applies a little bit of a crop, but the image stabilization out of this camera, it's got to be some of the best image stabilization I've seen to date. I'm actually super impressed with it. And just testing it out now, and throughout the time that I've had with this camera, I've actually done quite a little bit of just like walking and getting kind of like hyperlapse kind of content, and it's really quite nice. So literally just walking with it now, you can see just how stable it is. Okay, so I'm just going to press record inside of the camera, just walk up to the camera right now, and you can tell I'm not trying hard to keep it stable, but it is doing a remarkable job of it. Testing out down the streets in Cardiff to see what it would be like using it as like a dock camera or just grabbing nice smooth footage shots in and about an area. The camera captures these really well. It does hyperlapse, as you saw earlier, quite nicely as well, with a little bit of tweaking in post, of course. And then, of course, when it comes to longer focal lengths, it's not fantastic, but it's because I was moving, add a little bit of stabilisation, and it actually works out quite well. It's one of those, it has a lot of capabilities, but it's not necessarily perfect in every situation. The dynamic active image stabilization is only accessible on 4K and not on 8K. However, the stabilization inside of the camera still works out pretty well for most shots that you're really going to do. When it does come to using the dynamic active image stabilization, you do have a slight crop to the image, which is fine. If I'm honest, you get some of the best kind of like shots just purely handheld, which makes this camera a production workhorse. It's really fantastic in that retrospect, if I am honest with you. Now, you're probably asking about the autofocus, and this is one of the things that I feel like is perhaps one of the things which, in my personal opinion, cannot have been improved more with the A1. However, what I would say, it feels a lot more kind of like it's trying to work out kind of what it's focusing on. If you have a look at the actual like boxes that come up whilst you're shooting, throughout the entirety of it, it is actually finding the boxes in order to actually focus on it, ideally, no matter the kind of situation. As you can see there, it's trying to focus on my eye in the screen of the FX3 that's shooting me at the moment. And in my honest opinion, that's impressive in and of itself. What I saw through the camera here, it pretty much held focus throughout the entirety of this sort of like autofocus catwalk. Of course, I'm not necessarily the best model for doing the autofocus catwalk, so we actually used the model, and it looks pretty cool. Now we got her walking away from the camera. This is actually going to be on the 85mm f1.4 GM Mark II. At that 1.4 to test out how well it works at like a lot lower depth of fields. This was shot at 120p, so we're making sure that it's actually tracking for all of those seconds correctly and making, you know, as it goes along. As she was moving, it was creating boxes and ways for it to create the focus, which it did actually unfortunately miss a couple times there near the end. Through doing the street photography that I've done in the past, I do quite like firing from the hip as much as possible, as it kind of like allows you to kind of go unnoticed. You can get some kind of cool photos. The camera did manage to track all the subjects correctly, to the point where I almost had a little bit too much fun with that 30 frames a second. Again, this is nothing new, but it's nice to have it, and you don't necessarily need anything more for doing sports and nature photography. If you had an A1, then you're not going to be surprised that the image quality here isn't much different. Of course, when you zoom in, you're going to get fantastic images just in general. Sensor, although hasn't changed, still really nice to have, and I can't really put much more of an emphasis on how good that sensor actually is. So, although it would have been nice to have something new, it's still pretty fun to use. So, switching over to photo mode in the camera, you've actually got a few new things here, which one of them is the noise reduction settings, which you can turn on, and this basically fires your camera rapidly, and then later on you can reduce the noise if you're shooting in low light situations. This is purely going to work best when it does come to static subjects, so it's not necessarily something you'd be able to use at events. If I'm honest with you, it would be interesting to try, but I don't think it's something that's going to be working in that situation. And you can do up to 32 shots to combine to reduce the noise in just one image, which, you know, it's pretty impressive. And then, of course, when you come up, you got your pixel shift, which allows you to take a 200 megapixel image, or you can go for a ridiculous amount if you really want to. The other side to it is if you come here into drive mode, you've actually got the ability to do focus bracketing there. So you can then create super cool macro modes. This is something I'm going to have a little bit more of a test with, as it's something that I need to learn myself, because I've been getting into macro. It's quite a cool little world down there, really. What I do like, and I think it actually makes the camera phenomenal, is the screen. It's the only thing that, as a videographer, I miss out of the entire setup. But anyway, let's continue shooting and do have a little bit of fun, shall we? So I'm going to go handheld right now because I don't actually have another tripod for this one. What I'm going to be doing is doing a quick photo test, both on the nearer subject as well as a further subject, both on f2.8, comparing between 2470 f2.8 and the 28-70 f2, making sure the settings are matched up when it comes to the aperture, shutter speed and ISO. Going to shoot both 8K, check out the autofocus, and then also shoot the raw photos. Just going to get some B-roll of the actual shot though. All the shots coming up will be shot on Sony CineStyle in a picture profile. As you can see, there's not a massive amount of difference between them, apart from one's a little bit darker. This can be explained away by the fact that one was actually shooting RAW, and I can't access the RAW on the A1 II, at least at the moment. It would be nice to revisit this test after I have access to those RAWs. Now, the autofocus for the 8K seems to be working pretty damn well. It's, as you'd expect, pretty much both with the A1 and the A1 II. Don't get me wrong, it's still nice to have that AI autofocus, and it will learn and get better as you go along. Of course, here is the A1 Mark II, which is only really significant on the back, opposed to the original A1, which I'm actually shooting this with at the moment. It doesn't actually have the gold lettering on the side here, which I thought was a really nice kind of like addition to the original A1, and it's sad it's kind of actually been taken out here. Of course, when it comes to the A1 and the sort of like flagship cameras from Sony, you actually have all of the dials up on top, including your ability to select your drive mode, your autofocus capabilities, your custom dial, as well as your manual, shutter speed, aperture priority program settings, as well as changing between photo, video and S&Q there. I think when it comes to the actual interface on the camera, I really think that Sony have one of my favorites. It's just nice and clicky, does everything you kind of want it to, and it, you know, that's pretty good. So coming around to the front, of course, there's nothing new really here apart from the C5 button, which is the sort of like NOS mode of the actual camera. So you press that down and you go straight to the higher frames per second and shoot faster, which is something I really enjoyed about the A9 Mark III. I thought it was a really nifty kind of like setting, because I think for me, if I'm shooting, I'd like to be like, okay, I want to grab this at 11 frames a second. That's cool. However, if I see a subject that I want to make sure I capture, then I can always bump that up to 30 frames a second just by pressing the button, which I think is like an added extra. Nothing new here when it comes to the card ports. Of course, it is rated for faster cards at the moment, which is quite cool. But of course, it is the SD Type A card reader that you know you've come and love. On the back here, not much has changed. Again, it's just, you know, all of your custom buttons and settings like here. That's fantastic. The only kind of like thing to mention, of course, is this beautiful screen that comes from the A7. You've actually got the ability to do a composite low light RAW in here, which actually allows you to take multiple photos and reduce the grain profile of a photo. And I think you can have up to something ridiculous. You can have up to 32 raw photos in order to reduce the grain profile of the photo and make sure that it's as sharp as possible, which I think is actually like a nifty way to kind of help out these cameras that have a higher resolution, produce better, more well-rounded images. So that's really cool. Of course, on the side you've got Sony's lovely doors, and you've got all of the inputs that you really need there. So your flash, your multi-interface, your Ethernet, full HDMI, which is perfect for filmmaking, of course, and then your USB-C as well as your headphone and mic jack. So the big thing when it comes to this camera, and again this is a massive plus, is the fact that it's got the A9 body to it. So the A9 III body is a lot bigger, however it is a lot more comfortable and it just feels really good in your hand. The other thing is if you want to have a battery grip on there, the A1 battery grip is no longer going to work on there, so you're actually going to need to get yourself a VG C5, which is this one, vertical grip C5, to actually have on the A1, and it's actually what I'm going to be shooting most of this video with, and it's why I didn't actually have the battery port on the actual camera. So that is the kind of like profile that you'd be expecting out of your A1, and it'll be interesting to see what this kind of like does in comparison to the R1 from Canon and also the R5 from Canon there as well. I think it's a really powerful camera. However, there are some specs that I wish they did add into this one, and it's nice to see an upgrade, but is it enough of an upgrade? And hopefully I'm going to answer that in this video. Anyway, let's get into that now and talk about the pro and cons of if you want to get this camera or if you want to, you know, get the previous one, because I feel like that's the main question people are going to be asking here. I had access to this camera a day or so after the actual release of it, and I think that gave me a little bit of information as to kind of what most people were thinking, especially in a lot of the comment sections to reviews for it. Now, I think I understand where a lot of people are coming from. This is another camera from Sony that hasn't really introduced something completely game-changing, like I feel the A1 was originally. The A1, when it first came out, was a stellar camera, and still is a stellar camera even after, you know, the new release of this A1 too. When I had a chance to have a play with it and, you know, used it a little bit more, there are a few conclusions that I came to it. First of all, we really need to start talking about the price. Is it the right time to buy an A1 II? Is it worth the extra couple £100 that you would end up having to spend on it? So the original A1 is going for £5,500, and that's a little bit of a price decrease from where it was before, but the camera itself is excellent, and if I'm honest, if you're looking for kind of like a reason to get an A1 and you know, you just do wildlife photography, or you just need a good camera that has really good autofocus anyway, then there's not really much of a reason why you would want to spend out on an A1 II, especially when it does come to cashback deals that are happening at the moment. So you're looking to spend on the A1 £5,500 at the moment, okay? And then the A1 II is £6,300. Now, that's quite a large price hike from, you know, getting the original A1. And this is where we really need to talk. Are the differences in this camera enough for you to decide to get an A1 II? Now, there's two conclusions to this. First one being is really what you're looking to use the camera for. There are a lot of new things in this camera that add some kind of like invaluable tools for you out when you're shooting photography and video. That 8.5 stops of image stabilisation, I think, was perhaps one of the biggest things that I was personally excited for. Shooting with it in and around Cardiff, even though there was that little bit of crop when using the active dynamic stabilisation, I was really quite impressed with it, and if I'm honest, it's some of the best stabilisation that I've seen on the market, even to a certain extent beating out Lumix. So for that, I think the A1 II wins out on this thing if you're looking for the stabilisation aspect of it. When it comes to the ergonomics and the screen, I think these are really awesome tools, and it's nice to see in there. But I only really think they're going to be kind of like game-changing for people that actually shoot video. I've recently just actually had an A1, which is this up here, joined the crew when it comes to the gear that I use to shoot these videos. And it's one of those things where, like, do I see myself upgrading from this A1 to a A1 II? That's, for me, a really great question, because the A1 here is excellent. It does exactly what I want it to. It produces amazing image quality for when I'm reviewing lenses. It has that 8K video for when I'm doing top-down shots and I just want to be able to punch in, zoom in, get different shots, especially if I'm trying to vary things through a long video like this one. And it does that pretty well. And for $5,500, I think I've got a camera that is ultimately something that I would want to stay in my bag for a really long time. The other side of it, and this is kind of my second conclusion, is the added benefit of the screen, the noise reduction for photography. So if I'm shooting in darker environments like I tend to be this time of year, and I want to test out the sharpness of a lens in low light, I have that capability to a certain extent, a little bit more with this than I do with that. Ultimately, it's one of those things where, like, there are a few changes. Are they massive? No, not really. Do they justify how much you're looking to spend on an A1 II? I think marginally, yes, at least for me as a sort of like hybrid, I do pretty much everything kind of shooter. I think it's going to be great for people who are doing wildlife, events, sports, everything else in between. In fact, I did actually want to test this out in a boxing ring shoot, which unfortunately fell through last minute. Doesn't get me crazy, like it doesn't get me super excited knowing that there's an A1 II with slightly better specs. But what it does do is make a camera that was almost perfect, pretty much perfect. The only thing I think would have made the A1 II much better in my eyes is if they actually introduced higher spec for video. Perhaps, you know, like what would be really good is, because they tend to actually have really good slow motion more than before a lot of the other competition in the market, is if they did like 4K 240 or, you know, 4K downsampled from 8K 60, you know, it's not necessarily stuff we're going to be shooting day in, day out, but for those special circumstances, it's a really powerful tool to be able to use. Now, do I think 8K 60 is something that you need in a camera and it's the defining reason why a camera is good these days? No, because there's no point really shooting 8K 60 for 90% of the things that you shoot. Family stuff, you're not going to shoot 8K because that stuff you want to be able to get a lot of. I mean, there's even an argument to shoot kind of like your personal stuff in lower quality so you can store it a lot easier, but 4K, I think, tends to be the good kind of like mid-ground for that. So it doesn't necessarily need it. It would just be nice to have it and be nice for Sony to be like, yo, we are combating kind of like all of the other flagships at the moment. This is very much Sony's flagship camera. Although the thing I think makes me kind of like doubt that, I guess, is they've removed the gold off of the A1 and just made it white. So what does this really mean? We've got a camera here that is excellent and it is better than the original A1. Is it between £1,000 to £800 better? That's something for you to really decide. And I feel like I'm going to get in the comments a lot of people saying the same sort of thing, where it's going to be like, it's not worth it. This camera hasn't introduced anything new, as I've seen time and time again in a lot of the other reviews I've watched for it. But I think when it comes to it, the people who are going to buy this are A, people who are looking at the A1 and just want the best camera possible. The A1 II is that. That's plain and simple. It is the best camera possible. 2, are people going to buy it if they've already got an A1? I don't think there's enough of a increase, personally, to where I would change it out. However, that question is really answered by, do you want the best camera that Sony do? And this is quite frankly the best camera that Sony do. Really well spec'd for where it is. We don't necessarily need, and you look at Canon, Canon's new R1, which is kind of like the competitor to this. They didn't even do the 120 frames per second that a lot of the sports cameras are doing right now, because it's not necessarily something you need. If you can't take a photo in 30 frames, then you're not going to be able to capture it in 120 frames. Now, this does have the benefit of having the like NOS trigger on it, which I quite like, and I would have liked to have tested out a little bit more. Maybe we'll get permission from Sony to do it. I'm talking to a lot of places right now in order to be able to make these videos more interesting, more better, depending on kind of like what we can shoot. I can't wait to bring you more and more of this kind of stuff. I have actually gone a little bit further in depth than I do tend to with these videos today, and I hope you've appreciated it. I think it's actually been a really interesting kind of like test of the full capabilities of this camera. Anyway, like I said, if you enjoyed this video, please like, follow, and subscribe if you want to see more. Have a good day, and please let me know your opinion down below.
Easy.